They mocked the Comanche chief in public. What he did next changed the crowd. They did not expect him to hear the laughter, but the Comanche chief heard everything, standing still at the edge of the trading ground while the circle tightened and the words sharpened. Because mockery carried farther than bullets, and the men who laughed believed distance made cruelty harmless. Someone mimicked his accent. Someone exaggerated his posture. A boy repeated the gestures and earned approval from grown men who should have known better. And the chief watched it all with a face that revealed nothing. Because anger was a language the crowd already understood and expected him to speak. The sheriff stood nearby with his hands resting on his belt, eyes scanning the market instead of the moment, content to let ridicule pass as harmless noise. And the merchants pretended not to hear because laughter sold faster than justice. The chief had come to trade, nothing more, carrying pelts and quiet authority, his presence already an inconvenience to men who preferred him smaller, simpler, grateful. And when one voice finally called him a relic that should have vanished with the old wars, the laughter swelled into something bold enough to taste its own cruelty. He did not move. That unsettled them. Mockery depended on reaction, and his stillness felt like refusal. So they pushed harder, stepping closer, speaking louder, daring him to become the savage they wanted to prove existed. A man reached out and tugged the fringe of his coat, testing boundaries under the cover of humor, and the chief turned his head slowly then, eyes calm and level, meeting the man's gaze without threat, without fear, and the laughter thinned just enough to reveal unease beneath it. People watched closely now, sensing that this was the point where stories usually broke into violence, where the chief would reclaim dignity with force, and the crowd would claim justification afterward. The sheriff straightened slightly, ready for trouble at last, and hands drifted near holsters, because restraint made people nervous when they had prepared themselves for blood. The chief raised one hand, not in warning, not in surrender, but in command, and the gesture carried weight that surprised them, silencing the nearest voices first, then the rest. Because authority did not need volume when it was real. He spoke then, not loudly, not in anger, but clearly enough that every man and woman could hear him. And he said he had survived wars and winters and betrayals that would have broken smaller men, and that he had not come here to beg respect from laughter. He paused, letting the words settle. And in that pause, the crowd felt the shift begin. The sudden awareness that something unexpected was unfolding. Not retaliation, not submission, but a choice that would force them to see themselves in full daylight. The quiet did not arrive all at once. It crept in unevenly, leaving pockets of snickers that died when they realized no one was joining them. And the Comanche chief stood in that uneven hush as if he had placed it there himself. His hand still raised, his posture unchanged, forcing the crowd to sit with what they had started. He did not lecture them or list grievances, because explanation would have offered them something to argue with. And argument was another way of hiding. Instead, he lowered his hand and stepped forward into the open space they had cleared for mockery, boots firm on the packed earth, eyes moving from face to face with deliberate patience, counting them, remembering them, making each person aware they were being seen as clearly as they had seen him. The sheriff shifted his weight and cleared his throat, prepared to reassert control now that the mood had turned uncertain. But the chief spoke before he could, not challenging the badge directly, only stating that he had come in peace to trade, and that peace was not weakness simply because it was quiet. A merchant scoffed under his breath, trying to recover bravado, and the chief turned to him, asking calmly whether trade required insult to feel fair. And the man faltered, realizing the question demanded an answer rather than a joke. Children stopped fidgeting. A woman covered her mouth, not to hide laughter now, but to contain something closer to embarrassment. The chief continued, saying he would not answer mockery with violence, because violence would give the laughter an ending it did not deserve, and that he would not leave either, because leaving would teach the wrong lesson to those who watched. He said dignity was not proven by how hard a man could strike, but by how long he could stand without striking at all. And the words landed awkwardly, not poetic, not threatening, but heavy with experience. The sheriff finally spoke, telling everyone to move along, to return to business. But the chief looked at him then and asked whether order was meant to protect trade or people. And the question hung unanswered because the badge could not settle it without choosing sides. The crowd began to disperse in fits and starts, not because they had been dismissed, but because staying required confronting the moment they had tried to turn into entertainment. A few men lingered at the edge, resentment sharpening their expressions. But most drifted away quieter than they had arrived, carrying a discomfort that followed like a shadow. The chief watched them go, his face still composed. And when only a small circle remained, he gathered his goods again and said he would trade with those who wished to do so without ridicule. And he would remember who chose which kind of business today. In that measured offer, neither threat nor plea, the crowd felt the weight of consequence take shape. And for the first time since the laughter began, they understood that the change unfolding was not something done to them, but something they would have to live with. The crowd thought the moment had passed, that silence was the end of it, and that the Comanche chief would either leave quietly or linger long enough for resentment to harden back into mockery. But instead, he did something that forced them to stay present. He stepped toward the long table where trade was usually conducted, set his pelts down carefully, and began arranging them with deliberate calm, as if dignity were a craft practiced by the hands rather than a mood carried by the heart. The movement confused people because it denied them the climax they had prepared for. And confusion is harder to dismiss than anger. A merchant hesitated, then approached, curiosity winning over pride, and the chief met him with a neutral gaze, naming a fair price without raising his voice or lowering it, refusing to bargain against insult as if insult had never happened. Others gathered closer, drawn by the strange normalcy of the exchange. And the chief continued as though respect were the assumed ground rather than a concession, weighing goods, counting coins, acknowledging each person who addressed him without acknowledging the laughter that had preceded them. The sheriff watched closely now, realizing too late that control had slipped not through force, but through example, because order imposed from above could not compete with order practiced in public. A man who had laughed earlier lingered at the edge, wrestling with whether to step forward or retreat. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried less certainty than before, asking if the chief would trade with someone who had been disrespectful. The chief looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the crowd felt the weight of judgment gather, and then answered that trade was possible, but respect was required, and the man would have to decide which he was willing to offer. The words landed without cruelty, but they cut deeper than insult because they placed responsibility back where it belonged. The man swallowed, eyes flicking to the watching faces, and finally removed his hat, a small gesture that cost him more than he expected. And the chief nodded once and resumed the exchange. The crowd shifted again, murmurs changing tone, because they were witnessing power exercised without domination, and it unsettled the stories they had told themselves about strength. Children watched with open curiosity now, absorbing a lesson their elders had tried to teach backwards, and women leaned closer, no longer embarrassed but attentive. By the time the sun slid lower and the table had emptied, the trading ground felt altered, not purified or forgiven, but recalibrated. And those who remained understood that something irreversible had taken place. The chief gathered his remaining goods and prepared to leave, not chased out and not applauded, but acknowledged. And as he walked away, the crowd realized the mockery had not ended the moment. It had begun it. And the change they felt settling over them was not imposed by fear, but earned by restraint they could not ignore. The trading ground did not return to normal, not right away, because normal had depended on laughter that no longer felt safe to repeat. And the people who remained stood unsure of where to place their hands or their eyes, as if the rules had quietly changed without asking their permission. The Comanche chief moved through the space with measured calm, not lingering where he was not wanted and not retreating where he had been challenged. And that balance unsettled men who were used to authority arriving loudly or not at all. A woman stepped forward first, drawn by something steadier than curiosity, offering a bundle of cloth in exchange for pelts, her voice careful but respectful. And when the chief accepted without hesitation, the exchange felt like a small correction made in public. Others followed in cautious intervals, each transaction stripping a layer from the earlier mockery, replacing noise with the ordinary dignity of trade. The sheriff watched from the edge, aware that order was being restored without his instruction, and the realization made him uneasy because it exposed how easily he had allowed harm to pass when it wore the costume of humor. A boy who had mimicked the chief earlier tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering questions that had no easy answers, and the father silenced him with a hand that lingered too long, ashamed now of the lesson he had almost taught. The chief noticed the boy and paused, meeting his eyes briefly. Not stern, not forgiving, simply present. And the look carried enough weight that the child lowered his gaze, learning something without being told. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd thinned, not driven away but released from the need to perform, and conversations resumed in lower tones, stripped of bravado. A man approached the sheriff and asked quietly whether mockery was still considered harmless, and the question lingered longer than the answer, because it demanded reflection rather than enforcement. The chief finished his last exchange and gathered his remaining goods. And before leaving, he turned once more toward the trading ground, not to address the crowd as a whole, but to acknowledge those who had chosen differently after the laughter stopped. He said nothing about forgiveness or warning, only that respect, once broken, required effort to rebuild, and that effort was visible today. The words landed with unexpected force because they recognized change without exaggerating it, and people felt seen not as villains or heroes, but as participants who had made choices. When the chief finally walked away, the path opening without resistance, the trading ground remained quiet behind him. And those who stayed understood that the shift they felt was not relief, but responsibility, because the crowd had learned something it could not unlearn. The dignity withheld was a decision, and dignity offered, even late, carried the power to reshape what everyone thought they were allowed to become. The sheriff could not ignore the change any longer, not when the trading ground had quieted without his command, and not when people began glancing at him as if waiting for something he had already failed to do. And he stepped forward with the careful posture of a man trying to reclaim ground that had shifted beneath his boots. He spoke about keeping the peace, about how gatherings could turn if left unchecked, framing his words as concern rather than correction. But the crowd listened differently now, measuring his voice against the calm authority they had just witnessed. The Comanche chief did not interrupt or challenge him. He simply waited, hands resting at his sides, allowing the speech to finish the way a man allows weather to pass. and that patience made the sheriff's words sound thinner than he intended. When the sheriff finally paused, expecting acknowledgement, the chief asked a single question: whether peace meant the absence of violence or the presence of respect. And the simplicity of it unsettled the listeners because it refused to let peace hide behind procedure. A few men shifted uncomfortably, realizing the answer would implicate them no matter which way it was spoken. The sheriff replied that respect was important, but order came first. And the chief nodded once, accepting the honesty without agreeing to its comfort. Then said that order built on humiliation did not last, because it taught people to confuse silence with consent. The words were not sharp, but they carried far. And the crowd leaned in despite themselves, because no one was being accused directly, and yet everyone felt included. A merchant spoke up then, admitting that he had laughed because it felt easier than standing apart. And another added that he had stayed quiet because challenging the moment would have made him a target too. And with each admission, the sheriff's position narrowed. Not because he was wrong by law, but because the law had not been enough. The chief listened to every voice without correcting tone or motive, treating each confession as part of the same ledger. And when the last man fell silent, he said that strength was not proven by who could speak loudest, but by who could hear truth without turning away. That line settled heavily, not as judgment, but as recognition. And the crowd felt its weight because it applied to everyone present, including the badge. The sheriff removed his hat then, an instinctive gesture he did not seem to realize he was making, and said he would not allow mockery to pass as harmless again, not here, not openly. And while the promise sounded late, it sounded real enough to matter. The chief inclined his head in acknowledgement, not triumph, and gathered his goods, understanding the change rarely arrived cleanly and never all at once. As he walked away, the people watched with a different attention than before, not curious, not hostile, but thoughtful. And the sheriff stood longer than necessary, aware that authority had not been taken from him that day, but redefined in a way he could no longer ignore. The trading ground began to empty, not abruptly, but with intention, as if people needed distance to think without being watched. And the Comanche chief felt the weight of that choice more than the relief of it, because crowds rarely changed all at once, and never without leaving something unresolved behind. He walked toward the edge of the settlement at an unhurried pace, aware of eyes following him, not with hostility now, but with calculation, measuring what they had witnessed against the stories they had always told themselves about strength. A young man stepped into his path near the last row of stalls, the same one who had laughed the loudest earlier, his shoulders stiff with the effort of standing where he might be seen. And he spoke without mockery this time, asking why the chief had not answered insult with insult, why he had not proven himself the way people expected. The chief studied him for a moment, not to intimidate but to understand, then said that responding as expected would have taught nothing new, and that change required discomfort to be felt, not avoided. The answer left the young man unsettled, because it offered no excuse and no target, only responsibility, and he stepped aside without another word. Near the edge of the ground, a group of elders from the town stood together, speaking quietly, their expressions divided between pride and unease. And the chief realized that what had happened would be argued in kitchens and stores long after the dust settled, reshaped by memory and convenience, yet still carrying the seed of doubt he had planted. The sheriff approached one last time, slower now, his voice stripped of command, and said the situation could have turned violent, that restraint had kept the peace. And the chief agreed without flattery, replying that restraint was not the absence of power, but its discipline. The words lingered between them, and the sheriff nodded as if acknowledging a truth he would not repeat aloud. As the chief reached his horse, a child ran up and stopped short, unsure whether approach was permitted, and the chief crouched to the child's level, saying nothing, only meeting his eyes briefly before rising again. And the gesture carried more meaning than a lecture ever could. When he mounted and turned away, the settlement did not erupt back into noise. It held its quiet a moment longer, and in that pause, people felt the shape of what had changed. Not a rule, not a law, but an understanding that dignity could be enforced without violence, and that power did not always announce itself with threat. The chief rode on, not triumphant and not diminished, leaving behind a crowd that had learned something it would spend years deciding whether to accept. By evening, the story had begun to change shape, as stories always did once they were released from the place they were born. And the Comanche chief knew that whatever meaning settled would not be his to control, only his to endure. He camped beyond the last houses, where the land rose slightly, and the noise thinned to wind and insects. And from there, he could see the settlement glow and dim as lamps were lit and conversations spread, each retelling smoothing some edges and sharpening others. He tended his fire without hurry, movements practiced and calm, because patience was not something he adopted for display, but something he carried whether anyone watched or not. In town, men replayed the moment in their minds, some insisting they had meant no harm, others troubled by how easily laughter had turned them into participants, and a few quietly unsettled by the realization that nothing had forced them to join in, except habit. The sheriff sat longer at his desk than usual, hat set aside, replaying the question he had been asked about peace and respect. And he found that procedure no longer closed the gap it once had, because the crowd had seen an authority that required no badge to hold its ground. A merchant who had traded fairly that afternoon refused to laugh when the moment was joked about later, and the refusal drew looks sharper than any insult, because it asked others to notice their own reactions. Children repeated what they had seen in fragments, not understanding all of it, but sensing that something important had occurred. And parents corrected them less than usual, unsure which parts deserved explanation and which required silence. The chief ate sparingly and watched the stars appear, aware that dignity had a cost that extended beyond the day it was claimed, because reflection could harden into resentment if left unattended. He did not mistake the quiet for agreement or the shift for acceptance. He understood that some would nurse anger and wait for permission to release it later, and that others would carry the lesson forward without ever naming it. Before sleeping, he stood and looked once more toward the settlement, not with triumph or regret, but with the steady awareness that he had left them a mirror they could not easily discard. What they saw in it would decide more than his place among them. It would decide the kind of crowd they would become the next time laughter tempted them to forget who was being watched. The chief returned the next morning without ceremony, riding back into the settlement at a pace that suggested neither challenge nor retreat. And the people who noticed him first did not call out or warn others, because yesterday had taught them that attention itself could become a test. He dismounted near the trading ground, where the dust still held the memory of boots and laughter. And for a moment, he simply stood there, letting the place decide how it would receive him, now that the moment had passed. A few men looked up and then back to their work, uncertain whether ignoring him was respect or avoidance. And a woman who had traded with him the day before offered a nod that was small but intentional, the kind that acknowledged change without demanding gratitude. The sheriff watched from a distance, saying nothing, and the absence of his voice felt deliberate this time, as if restraint had become his chosen language too. The chief moved through the stalls again, trading quietly, paying fair prices, asking nothing extra for what he had endured, And the normalcy of it unsettled people more than confrontation would have, because it forced them to recognize that dignity did not require a stage to exist. A man who had mocked him openly the day before lingered nearby, clearly wrestling with whether to speak. And when he finally stepped forward, his words came out wrong at first, tangled in pride and discomfort. But he managed to say that he had laughed because everyone else did, and that it had seemed easier than standing alone. The chief listened without interruption, then replied that ease was often the enemy of honor, and that recognizing it was the beginning of choosing differently. And the man nodded, relief and shame mixing on his face as he stepped back. The crowd did not gather this time. Instead, individuals approached in ones and twos, interactions small enough to feel manageable, and the trading ground slowly relearned how to function without spectacle. By midday, the chief had finished his business, and when he prepared to leave again, there was no mockery to answer and no applause to accept. Only a quiet awareness moving through the settlement that something fragile had been earned. As he mounted his horse and turned away, a child raised a hand in an uncertain wave, and the chief lifted his own in return. A gesture so simple it felt almost dangerous in its sincerity. The people watched him go, not as a curiosity or a threat, but as a reminder that change did not always arrive with noise, and that the hardest work often began after the crowd had dispersed and the laughter had nowhere left to hide. By the time the chief disappeared beyond the last rise, the settlement felt strangely exposed, as if the noise that usually covered its habits had been stripped away, and people returned to their routines with an unease they could not quite name. Men went back to weighing grain and counting coins, but conversations kept circling the same place, stopping and starting as if everyone sensed there was a wrong way to tell the story and no agreed-upon right one yet. Some insisted the chief had embarrassed them on purpose, that his calm had been a kind of provocation, while others argued that the embarrassment had already existed and had simply been revealed in daylight. The sheriff walked the street longer than usual, nodding to faces that no longer looked away as quickly, aware that his silence the day before had become part of the tale, whether he approved or not. A shopkeeper who had laughed loudest found himself unable to repeat the joke when customers pressed him for it, and the hesitation unsettled him more than punishment would have, because it forced him to confront the choice he had made and the ease with which he had made it. In kitchens and back rooms, parents corrected their children less sharply when they asked questions about the chief, unsure whether repeating old warnings still felt justified, and the uncertainty lingered like smoke after a fire that had burned too fast. Not everyone felt changed. Some hardened instead, deciding that restraint was weakness and that the crowd should never have been allowed to feel small. And those men spoke to one another in low voices, nursing resentment that would wait for a safer moment. But even among them, something had shifted, because they now knew their laughter could be seen for what it was, and being seen had cost them comfort. A woman who had covered her mouth during the mockery caught sight of herself reflected in a window and looked away, remembering the moment she could have spoken and didn't. And the memory followed her through the day like a quiet companion she could not dismiss. By evening, the story had settled into many versions, none of them complete, but each carrying a fragment of truth that could not be entirely smoothed over. The crowd had not become better all at once, and no rule had been written to force it so. But something heavier than law had been placed among them, a shared awareness that dignity withheld was an action, not an accident. And as night fell and lamps were lit, the settlement learned that what changed a crowd was not always what happened in public, but what each person was left to carry home once the laughter was gone and the mirror remained. When the chief did not return again, the settlement felt the absence more sharply than his presence had ever been felt. because absence left people alone with their thoughts instead of distracted by reaction. And the days that followed moved with an unfamiliar caution. The trading ground regained its noise slowly, laughter returning in careful pieces that tested the air before committing. And when mockery threatened to rise, it often stalled, dying in throats that remembered how quickly a crowd could be made to see itself. The sheriff adjusted his patrols, not in number but in attention, stepping in sooner when voices sharpened. And though he never spoke of the chief again, his silence carried a different weight now, as if restraint had been relearned the hard way. Merchants traded more deliberately, less eager to turn difference into spectacle. And while not all hearts softened, enough minds hesitated to change the rhythm of the place. Children remembered the moment most clearly, reenacting it in fragments that stripped away the cruelty and kept the calm. Because youth recognized power that did not need permission. And parents listened with an unease that bordered on respect. The man who had laughed the loudest avoided the trading ground for a time, not punished, just unsettled. And in that space, others learned that consequence did not always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrived as reflection that refused to leave. Weeks later, a different chief from a neighboring band passed through, and the settlement received him with cautious courtesy. Not because it had become enlightened, but because it had learned what embarrassment felt like when dignity was denied too openly. The change was imperfect and uneven, but it was real enough to matter. And those who noticed it understood that it had not been commanded into existence. The Comanche chief had not demanded apology, tribute, or obedience. He had demanded presence, and in doing so had made the crowd responsible for what it chose to become next. Long after his name blurred into rumor, the lesson remained sharper. That power did not always announce itself with threat. That restraint could wound pride more deeply than violence. And that a crowd, once forced to see itself clearly, could never fully return to the comfort of unexamined laughter. If this story made you think, like the video, share it with someone who values dignity and subscribe for more Western American tales.